June 1939, Oklahoma. A wave of violent robberies has left the small cities of Seminole, Tecumseh, and Shawnee on the edge. This is the post-Great Depression era. Desperation and crime aren't uncommon, but this time, something is different. G-men, government agents, are swarming the towns, questioning the locals and scanning every dusty road and train station. They aren't just chasing bank robbers, they are hunting two fugitives who supposedly did the impossible: escape from the maximum security hellhole known as Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. And this is just the start. From daring helicopter escapes to master-level lockpicking, we're revealing some of the most creative prison breaks in history on today's episode of the Infographics Show. Escape from Alcatraz, the other one. Now, you might be thinking, hold on a second, no one ever actually successfully escaped from Alcatraz, right? Or if anyone did, it had to be those three genius inmates who vanished on June 11, 1962, that all the escape movies are based on. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and his brother Clarence Anglin didn't just escape, they engineered one of the most daring prison breaks in history. Armed with nothing but spoons and forks and a homemade electric drill to dig and scrape their way out of the cells over 6 grueling months. They even went as far as to make life preservers from 50 raincoats and designed papier-mâché heads to leave behind in their beds. After scaling down 50 feet of prison piping and slipping past not one but two towering 12-foot barbed wire fences, the men reached the shore. There, under the cover of darkness, they unfolded their carefully crafted 6 by 14-foot rubber raft, and that was that. They were sailing through the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay, never to be seen again. Or were they? Sure, the odds of them sipping cocktails in Brazil in their 90s are pretty slim, but did they ever make it to shore? Or did they all just drown back in '62? No one knows. But that wasn't the first attempt to break free from Alcatraz. That honor goes to armed robber Joseph Dutch Bowers. Bowers is believed to be the son of an Austrian traveling circus family, and he was sentenced to 25 years in Alcatraz for holding up the postal mail, getting away with a huge bounty of $16.38. 3 years into his sentence, and he was seen feeding pigeons, and according to a prison officer, he tried to scale down a 50-foot fence to the ground below. The officer opened fire, and Bowers plummeted to his death. Whether he was just feeding birds, trying to get a better view of the bay, or genuinely trying to escape is still a matter of controversy. But what's not controversial is the fact that breaking out of the rock was nigh on impossible. Over the 29 years that Alcatraz was open as a prison, 1934 to 1963, 36 men in 14 different attempts tried to break out. 6 were shot and killed in the act, 8 gave up, and many were captured. 2 guys definitely drowned, and 5 just vanished into thin air. This brings us back to the start. The story of possibly a successful escape that seems to have been forgotten in the ashes of history. You haven't seen the movie because there isn't one. After Bowers' deadly plunge, this became only the second time a prisoner or prisoners attempted to get over the walls and brave San Francisco Bay's icy waters. The men were Theodore Ted Cole, prisoner AZ-258, just 24 at the time of escape, and Ralph Roe, prisoner AZ-260, who was the ripe old age of 31. Both men were born into the dust and desperation of the Depression-era Oklahoma, where poverty wasn't just a reality, it was a way of life. Trouble wasn't just something they found, it was in their blood. They aced troublemaker school with flying colors, graduated from petty crime with honors, and before long, they were young bank robbers with a knack for making headlines. Cole was sentenced to sizzle in the electric chair after robbing a bottle works in Tulsa. Roe, on the other hand, got off light. A cool 99-year sentence for surviving a bloody shootout with local cops and FBI agents in Shawnee. His partner wasn't so lucky. He left the fight in a body bag. Both men had attempted to escape from their respective prisons, so as extreme escape risks, they were transferred to an island no man could supposedly escape from. Although they didn't know each other before spending time in Alcatraz, the two got to chat, and during their transfer, they quickly realized that they were birds of a feather. Birds that had no intention of being locked up in cages or frying in a chair. Roe was the brains of the pair, said to be able to keep a cool head in difficult situations. Cole was known as someone who would use extreme violence. After starting his career as a thief at the age of 14, he caused so much havoc in these small towns in Oklahoma, the local press gave him the moniker Teddy the Terrible. At Cole's sentencing, Tulsa County District Judge Saul A. Yeager said it was only a matter of time till Cole started murdering people, so for the public good, the only place for him was the electric chair. He was irredeemable, Yeager said, but this led to widespread protests from the concerned public and civil rights organizations. Cole subsequently won an appeal and his sentence was reduced to 15 years. Now that seems like a win for human rights in America until Cole proved Judge Yeager right. He popped his murder cherry by killing his cellmate over what was likely just a petty disagreement. But when he stood trial, fate cut him a break. Instead of a one-way ticket to the chair, Cole walked away with just a longer sentence. Before Alcatraz, while Cole was serving time at McAllister Penitentiary, he almost got over the wall only for a guard to spot him and shoot him down. Now with a reputation as an incorrigible escape artist, he later sawed through his cell's bars, only to discover the authorities were watching. They were so sure that he'd try to escape that they wired a device up to his cell. In November 1934, his escape ambitions almost came to fruition. He smuggled himself in a laundry bag, which was then loaded onto the back of a truck. The prison gates were opened and the engine kicked into gear, taking Cole toward freedom. When the truck stopped to unload in town, he calmly got out and bid farewell to the driver. Flat broke and desperate, he hitchhiked to Cushing, Oklahoma, where he decided to make his own luck by taking pipeline worker James Rutherford hostage. With a gun to Rutherford's head, Cole forced him to drive straight to Texas, where he engaged in a crime spree. Robbery after robbery, he stuffed his pockets full of cash. But his freedom was short-lived. Within weeks, he was caught in Dallas, dragged back into the system, and shipped off to the one place that could finally hold him, Alcatraz. And after everything he'd done, he wasn't just looking at hard time, he was facing 50 long years. As for Roe, he also started crime early, but unlike Cole, he was known to be part of some serious outfits. Still young, he teamed up with the outlaw Wilbert Underhill, aka the Mad Dog of the Underworld, and the Tri-State Terror, both of them tormenting the small towns of Oklahoma, where they plied their violent trade of theft. For years, the authorities tracked those guys, only for that shootout to happen and force them into early retirement. Roe was hit, as was his girlfriend Eva, while Underhill escaped injured, but then later died in a hospital. Roe's 99-year sentence reflected just how much of a feared outlaw he had become. Like Cole, Roe did a stint in McAllister Penitentiary. While there in 1929, he smuggled himself into a wooden box, but pretty soon he found it difficult to breathe. After kicking his way out, Roe was soon escorted back to his cell. Given his fierce reputation and the fact that he was smart, it was decided the best place for him was the Rock. So on October 26, 1935, both men, handcuffed and surrounded by prison officers, were ushered from the McDowell ferry boat and into Alcatraz. Security was especially tight that day. Some of the U.S.'s most violent criminals were making the trip with Cole and Roe. Two of them, Rufus Franklin and Thomas R. Lemrick, were both bank robbers and would one day become part of the third escape attempt, killing a guard in the process. Both were shot during the escape attempt, Limerick dying from his injuries and Franklin spending many years in solitary confinement. In an astonishing twist of fate, one of the men on the boat that day was Rufus McCain. Back in 1939, McCain and four others, including the infamous ruthless Arthur Doc Barker of the notorious Barker Carpus Gang, pulled off what could have been Alcatraz's greatest escape. The five men, all serving countless years for bank robberies, kidnappings, and murder, sawed through their cell bars, slipped out into the night, and almost became legends. Once outside, they split up. Barker and another man bravely dove into the freezing waters only to struggle against the currents. Desperate, they tried building a raft from driftwood, but time wasn't on their side. By then, the prison was on high alert. Guards in the watchtowers had spotted movement and opened fire. A bullet ripped through Barker, leaving him bleeding in the surf and capturing the other guy. Pretty soon, a guard boat emerged from the thick fog with rifles and angry faces pointed at the escapees. Years later, one of the escapees made sure McCain would pay for that night. Young drove a handmade knife straight into McCain's stomach, a blade he crafted in the prison's furniture shop. His lawyer said he'd been driven insane by all the time he spent in solitary confinement, and he blamed it on McCain being a coward that day. What did these stories tell us about escaping from Alcatraz? They tell us even if you get into the water, you still have the hardest part of the escape left. Still, Cole and Roe were sure they could do it. After experiencing the dungeon, solitary confinement for various transgressions, both men got a job in the mat shop. This was where prisoners shredded old tires to make mats for the U.S. Navy. It was also where Cole and Roe first started conspiring about an escape. On December 16, 1937, they did it. Cole was working in the blacksmith shop at the time, while Roe was in the adjoining mat shop. All 30 prisoners were there for head count at around 1 p.m. But when the guard returned for the next count just 30 minutes or so later, 2 men were missing. It was soon discovered that someone had sawn through the iron bars on one of the windows. It was obvious this had taken weeks. The prisoners covering the saw marks with grease every time that they were done for the day. Once they'd gotten through the bars, they popped out the thick panes and managed to crawl through the hole. They'd obviously been watched by other prisoners, but it wasn't as if anyone was going to try to stop them. After all, the prison demanded total silence. It was revealed that Roe and Cole had taken a pipe wrench with them on their expedition so they could smash out a lock on one of the gates of the wire fences. Once that was done, they'd scaled down about 20 feet to the ground below. The real reason Alcatraz was called the prison no one could escape from wasn't its iron bars, its high-tech cells, or its towering walls. It was the water. The shoreline of San Francisco was only 1.25 miles away, a fairly easy distance to swim even for someone without much experience. If your life depended on it, most people could manage that distance in a regular swimming pool. But this wasn't a regular swimming pool, it was a very dangerous stretch of water. First of all, it was cold, especially in the winter when Roe and Cole broke out. The water would have been anywhere from 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, making hypothermia possible within just minutes. The water in the bay is also choppy. The often strong tidal currents are enough to sweep even a good swimmer out to sea. But that doesn't mean escape wasn't possible for these two men. So on that December day, Roe and Cole vanished forever. One of the last people to see them was a former public enemy number 1, the super smart Alvin Karpis. He later reported that he'd watched Cole and Roe navigate the perimeter, get past the submerged barbed wire, and then take off in the direction of the bay. Karpis said the men quickly disappeared under a veil of fog, which would have made it hard for authorities to find them. He claimed that he saw them trying to use tires or fuel canisters, and after a while, he reckoned they just sank. Although thanks to the thick fog, that was just a guess. It was an embarrassment for the authorities. If the guys had died, where were their bodies and the flotation devices they had obviously used? The FBI couldn't be sure that they'd drowned, so they were added to the most wanted list. What ensued was one of the biggest manhunts in U.S. history, taking up to 500 pages of reports that all led to nothing. And then came the sightings. A couple of hitchhikers spotted two strange men they later identified as Roe and Cole. Then a taxi driver in Cole's hometown of Seminole said that he had definitely seen them. He would not forget a face because one of them had fired his gun at him while they were in the process of committing one of their armed robberies. Two men matching the exact descriptions of Roe and Cole started pulling off crimes just like the ones Roe and Cole were known for, in the very towns where they grew up. And this all happened right after they vanished. Coincidence? The FBI didn't think so. Pretty soon, these towns were crawling with G-men. 2 years later, the San Francisco Chronicle claimed the two men were living somewhere in South America, which led FBI agents to getting on a plane and expanding their manhunt to a new continent. Did they find them? Of course not. But that doesn't mean Mr. Roe and Mr. Cole didn't spend the rest of their lives sipping on caipirinhas, proud of the knowledge that they were the only men to ever escape from the Rock. Let's move across the pond for our next escape and talk about a man who might just be the greatest escaper in history, the Invisible Irishman. It's one thing to escape from prison, but it's another thing staying escaped. Hardly anyone in history who breaks out of prison stays free, but this next guy, he was a certified genius at evading the clutches of the law. John Patrick Hannon, once dubbed the world's most elusive criminal, wasn't exactly public enemy number 1. At just 22, he was an ordinary Irish guy who found himself in England in 1955, where a stolen car and a little too much enthusiasm in a scuffle with two cops earned him 22 months behind bars. His destination was HM Prison The Verne, on the island of Portland, Dorset. For Hannon, that was 21 months too many, because just 30 days into his sentence, Hannon took off with another inmate. In that classic breakout trope, they knotted bed sheets together to make a rope to scale down the prison wall. Sticking to the train tracks, they moved quickly, despite standing out like sore thumbs in their gray prison overalls. Sure, they were on an island, but with the English mainland just 4 miles away and connected by rail, slipping into the quaint coastal towns of Dorset wouldn't be too difficult. If they could just make it that far, they might actually disappear. After breaking into a closed gas station to steal smokes and beers, they split up, only for Hannon's escape partner to be picked up by the cops 16 hours later. As much as the English cops tried, they just couldn't find Hannon, despite setting up roadblocks and initiating a thorough manhunt consisting of armies of cops and sniffer dogs. The British cops never stopped looking for Hannon. About 45 years later, in 2001, an investigator told the BBC, "Continual checks are made, making life extremely difficult for the individual concerned and indeed for their family and friends." That year, another investigator told The Guardian that they'd love to hear from him as they have some unfinished business, even if he just drops them a line. It's unlikely he'll ever drop them a line. Hannon's been on the run for over 70 years, longer than most criminals ever dream of. At one point, the media even suggested that if he came forward, he would earn a spot in the Guinness Book of World Records for the longest time an escaped prisoner had evaded capture, which sounds an awful lot like bait. Before Hannon, the record belonged to an American, Leonard Frisco. In 1920, he gunned down 2 sheriff deputies and was locked up in Carson, Nevada. But by 1923, he was gone, vanishing into thin air. For 46 years, he lived as a free man. Then in 1969, a family feud sealed his fate. After a falling out, his own son turned him in. Papillon Mark II. Pascal Paillet was a man who didn't just break out of prison, he did it in style. He used helicopters, and yes, that is plural, he did it more than once. By 1997, 34-year-old Pascal Paillet was no stranger to prison. He'd already done time for assault and conspiracy. But that was nothing compared to what came next. That year, he joined a heavily armed gang in Marseille, setting their sights on an armored car loaded with cash. Desperation and greed fueled their attack, and then the bullets started flying, 14 rounds from a Kalashnikov, killing a guard. Paillet was subsequently handed a 30-year sentence, but he didn't intend to serve much of it. On October 12, 2001, Paillet was serving time at Luynes prison in southern France when his friend Frédéric Impolco hijacked a helicopter and picked up Paillet from the prison roof. Paillet was free, but his buddies who'd committed the robbery with him weren't. And that didn't sit well with him, so he planned to get a helicopter and spring them out. On April 4, 2003, Paillet and his team swooped down to the prison roof in their stolen bird and picked up Paillet's companions, Michel Valero and Eric Alborio, along with a drug trafficker named Franck Perletto. It was another escape worthy of a Hollywood movie. But how could they stay hidden when the entire country was after them? The men decided to rent a small cottage in the beautiful French countryside, introducing themselves to locals as athletes who'd come to practice for an upcoming biathlon. They were soon popular, regaling the locals with stories of their many sporting victories. Meanwhile, hidden in the cottage was a cache of powerful weapons and stacks of money. Parked outside were several high-performance sport cars, so the locals just thought that these guys were like them, rich. One of the locals liked them so much that he gave them the use of a swimming pool, completely unaware he was dealing with some of the scariest figures of Marseille's renowned underworld. In May of that same year, these high-flying athletes got a rude awakening when French cops busted down their front door at 6 in the morning. The police were taking no risks, bringing 40 officers to the party. This came as quite a shock to the convicts, who'd arranged that day to borrow horses from one of their new friends and go for a trot around the splendid vineyards of Côte d'Iron. Since the guys were fast asleep, the operation went off without a single shot being fired. A news article explained the searches led to the discovery of a large arsenal, including weapons of war as well as large sums of money in euros, dollars, and Swiss francs. Paillet was back where he started, sitting in a prison cell with an extra 6 years for his original escape and another 7 years for arranging the escape of his criminal friends. Worse, he was now being watched every second of every day. He was held in solitary confinement with a plan to transfer him at least once every 6 months. The French media was calling him the King of Escapes, but it wasn't looking like he was going to repeat another great feat of breaking out. How could he? He was living in a box without any contact with the other prisoners. These conditions were so appalling that Paillet wrote a letter of appeal titled The Saga of My Transfers. He explained that they'd moved him 9 times in just 30 months, making it impossible for him to settle. To push the point home, he'd begun a hunger strike. He was kept under constant surveillance, and it was frankly impossible to escape. But that is exactly what he did. It was July 14, 2007, in the middle of the Bastille Day celebrations where prison officers weren't perhaps on their A game. As Paillet sat in front of the recording devices in his solitary confinement cell, his friends were busy stealing a helicopter from the Cannes Mandelot airport. With guns pointed at the pilot's head and masks over their faces, they told him his next stop was the prison. They managed to land the chopper on the roof, head down to the solitary wing, and with guns at the ready, spring their friend out. The entire operation from landing on the roof to flying away took just 5 minutes. According to the pilot, notwithstanding having a gun pointed at his face, the men were quite nice. He told the media there was no violence. They told me if I followed orders there would be no harm. He did as they asked and they let him go as soon as they ditched the helicopter. But Paillet's great escape didn't last for long. French authorities working with Spanish police picked up Paillet and his accomplices in a suburb just outside of Barcelona. This time, the authorities have kept Paillet's location a secret. Okay, now for what is arguably the smartest escape in the episode: the South African Houdini. December 11, 1979. Inside Pretoria Central Prison, one of South Africa's most brutal lockups, 3 men are just 10 doors away from freedom. Leading the escape is Afrikaner Tim Jenkin and his associate Stephen Lee. With them is Alex Mumbaris, an Egyptian with French and Australian citizenship. These 3 men are part of a small group of high-profile political prisoners in this high-security dungeon that prides itself on being one of the most secure prisons in the country. The plan was to simply slip through the doors, stroll out the front entrance, and walk past the guard towers and security fences without anyone so much as blinking. Jenkins and Lee were serving hefty prison sentences, 12 and 8 years respectively, for defying the apartheid regimes and spreading the message of the then illegal African National Congress via homemade leaflet bombs. Mumbaris, another activist, only non-Afrikaner speaking political prisoner in Pretoria Central, he had been handed 12 years for allegedly trying to instigate violent revolution in South Africa. This wasn't going to be the kind of breakout that involved guns or helicopters or tunnels dug with spoons. They really did just plan to walk out, like they were invisible men. Jenkins wasn't just clever, he was a craftsman, a natural with wood. He noticed that the lock on his cell door looked like a fairly standard key lock, and with a bit of effort he could open it. First he needed the key's depth. Slipping paper inside the lock, he carefully mapped its shape. After that, he spent time observing the guards as they walked past, focusing on the keys on their belts. If he could just get the design right, then he could carve his own key from wood. And as luck would have it, he and the other prisoners had a job in the prison's carpentry workshop. He started with the key to his cell, knowing very well that if he got caught, a beating was possible, and since he was already enemy number one in South Africa, they would throw the book at him. He didn't care. He told Lee and some other political prisoners his plan. He was going to escape by getting out of his cell and somehow over the prison walls. After taking the measurements and cutting the key in the workshop, he sneaked it out in a thermos flask. When he tried the lock that night, it didn't work at first. He had a file that he smuggled into his cell, and with some small changes, he was opening and closing the door at will. The problem was, right behind it was another door, a thick metal one, and the lock was on the outside. This made it pretty much impossible to take the measurements. Even if he made a key, how would he test it? With the other prisoners in his section helping, he waited until Friday. This was the day when the whole block cleared the section, giving Jenkins the time to look at the lock as the others kept watch for officers. On the first Friday, he took the measurements. The next, he put his wooden key to the test. It didn't quite work. With the other standing guard, he started filing, adjusting, fine-tuning, and then the key turned. The door opened. But now he had another problem. The key turned, the bolt extended, but it wouldn't retract. The door stayed open. If he couldn't reset the lock, the guards would immediately spot that someone had tampered with it. Guards were walking toward Jenkins down the corridor as he struggled, pulling and twisting, trying not to snap the key. He felt sick inside. This was it. 15, 20 more years in prison. The warden was just around the corner, his rattling keys getting louder and louder. What could Jenkins do? So he just got up and walked away, leaving the bolt in its extended position. As the inmates kept on cleaning, occasionally glancing at the warden's facial expression, they were relieved when the guards started blaming each other for the bolt issue. They dodged a bullet, but the problem still remained. What were they supposed to do now? It was obviously too risky to do the key tests on cleaning days. They somehow needed to test at night. But how? That's when our South African Houdini got another bright idea. Each cell had a broom that the men used to sweep their cells in the morning. So why not fix the key to the end of the broom, connected to a kind of crank? He could reach the keyhole and, using the crank mechanism, turn the key. After much trial and error, he succeeded. Now he could get through the second door, the one to the landing. From here, he could use the first key to open the doors to everyone else's cells. There were obviously a lot more doors in the prison, plus guard towers, 2 razor wire fences, and armed patrols with dogs prowling the perimeter. Then there was the small matter of the night warden, who regularly checked in each man's cell. First things first, thought Jenkins, door 3. This was the one at the end of the section. Rather than risk trying to make and test a key at night, again the men waited until Friday cleaning to do the business. Jenkins couldn't believe his luck. The key for door 1 also worked in door 3. It was a major security blunder for a high-security prison. That's when Jenkins shocked his comrades and said, "Forget about scaling fences, we'll just walk out the front door." The plan was to merely make a key for every door that stood between them and freedom. It was Lee who came up with the next part of the plan. At this point, the men had no idea just how many doors they would have to get through. So one day, Lee started howling in pain, telling the guards he needed to see a dentist. After being taken outside, Lee was stunned. He realized they needed to pass through 10 doors if they were to taste freedom again. It was a tall order. Lee told Jenkins that door 4 led down the stairs to the admin section, and doors 5 and 6 would get them to the office where the night warden stayed. Then came the hard part. Doors 7, 8, and 9 were close together down a corridor, but these were also very close to the office, so opening them could alert the warden. Then there was door 10, the front door of the prison. If the men somehow could get out, they would have to have a getaway car waiting for them. They knew that once the alarm was raised, they'd have pretty much every cop in South Africa looking for them. This wasn't going to be easy, especially as they hadn't thought about guards also being outside of the prison. This was where Mumbaris came in, a man with an iron will who was unafraid to take risks. He helped the men develop a plan for what Jenkin had later called an insuperable problem. If Jenkin was the toolmaker, Mumbaris was the logistics man. The good news was that the warden had a fixed routine that you could set your watch to. Each night, he placed a record on the turntable, and classical music drifted through the intercom. As soon as the music was finished, the warden went on his inspection, walking around the sections and checking each cell and the men inside them. As some of the cells were at the top floor landing, including the cells of Jenkin, Lee, and Mumbaris, the men had a window of opportunity. When the music came on, they would sneak out of their cells, walk downstairs. The moment the warden set off, they would run to the doors so they could make new keys. The obvious question was, how would they hide from the warden since there was only one corridor? The answer was a small closet at the bottom of the stairs, a tiny cupboard that they could crouch in. The men worked out that it usually took him 15 minutes to get back to the office. Jenkin had pre-made the keys that were similar to the others, so the plan was, when they got to the new doors, they could check the keyholes and with the file shape the keys there and then. As planned, when the warden's music played, Jenkin and Mumbaris got out of their cells, opened door 3, went downstairs, and hid in the closet. The music stopped. The men struggled to keep the closet doors locked, holding them with the end of their fingers. You could hear the drop of a pin as the warden's footsteps approached, his keys jangling in his hands. Jenkin could just about make out the warden through the slats in the door. Both men were shaking, sweat running down their cheeks. The rhythmic tapping of shoes on the floor grew louder and louder until the warden's figure passed by the door. It was at that exact moment that Mumbaris' sweat-soaked fingers caused him to lose his grip on the door. It flew open with a creak, and the warden was just a few feet away. The warden just kept walking, scaling the stairs to the top of the landing. They knew they only had around 15 minutes before the warden made his return trip. They sprinted down the corridor, and to their great surprise and joy found that the warden hadn't even bothered to lock door 4, so they ran to door 5, and again, the gods were looking down on them because Jenkin's cell key was a perfect fit. Again, this was a high security oversight of the highest order, but that was the last time they'd be dealt good fortune. Door 6 looked formidable. It was a wall between them and their freedom, between justice and a rotten system that had plagued South Africa. As the warden was upstairs looking into their cells where they'd left rudimentary dummies in their beds, Jenkin tried all the keys that he'd made as Mumbaris faced the other direction, watching out for the warden's return. Jenkin frantically worked at the key, but time was running out. They had to go. The warden was close. One more minute and the whole plan was blown. As the two men treaded lightly and as fast as they could, they heard the clack of the warden's footsteps on the stairs. With just seconds to spare, they got into their little closet space and pulled the doors closed. The warden passed by, completely unaware of the two men hiding mere feet away. They hadn't breached door 6, but it wasn't exactly a failed mission. For the next week, Jenkin lay awake in bed, each night trying to come up with a solution. He and Mumbaris returned to door 6 several times over the next week or so, but each time they failed to get it open. It was just a matter of time until they pushed their luck too far and ended up in solitary confinement and more years in prison. There was only one thing for it. They had to design a different kind of key. Obviously, door 6 was important to the prison, and the lock was far more intricate. So the obvious solution was to make a more intricate key. Jenkin got to work on what he called a shaftless key, a device made from wire and wood that could be manipulated until they could find the correct shape. For all intents and purposes, this was a skeleton key, but to make it work, they'd need a lot longer than 15 minutes. This is where Lee came in. The next time the warden walked across the landing peering into the cells, Lee got up from his bed, claiming that he couldn't sleep. If there was one thing everyone knew about the night warden, it was that he loved rugby. So Lee asked him about the score of one of the latest games. This was a topic the warden was seemingly happy to discuss on a typically lonely night shift. Down below, the guys fiddled with their new key, and after some twisting and turning, the door opened. Jenkin and Mumbaris barreled along to door 7 and discovered to their utter amazement that its lock was about as intricate as a child's toy. Just 3 more doors to go. Jenkin and Mumbaris had no idea at all how much time they had, but there was no going back now. Door 8 was already open. Door 9 wasn't so much a prison door, but a regular wooden thing. It also opened easily. As the warden tired of Lee's questions and might have been feeling tinges of suspicion, the two men faced the only thing keeping them from the outside. Door 10, the one that they'd walked through on their first day of prison. The good news is, it was just a regular house door. After a quick inspection, the guys knew they had to be getting back to the cupboard. Little did they know that the warden was already a minute or so away from the bottom of the stairs. They moved with the stealth of ghosts and made it back just in time for the warden to walk past them. It was agreed by all the next run would be the actual escape. There was little to no chance Lee could pull off another long chat with the warden without him smelling a rat, so they just had to take their chances with door 10. As things stood, given what they faced so far, there was about a 75% chance that they'd get through it without any problems. If they failed, with the warden doing his regular 15-minute walk, they would all be caught. Unless they asked another prisoner to play the part of decoy. They enlisted a man who was viewed as the leader of the political prisoners, Dennis Goldberg. Goldberg was an anti-apartheid activist who was serving a life sentence after being deemed a threat to the security of the South African state. The escape wasn't news to Goldberg. He'd been one of the 8 men in the original plan. But when it started to look too ambitious, he stepped back and agreed to help the men with a getaway car. So Goldberg was more than happy to be the man who delayed the warden. Talking about rugby was out of the question, so Goldberg said he'd be the one to call the warden after the men hit the flip switch for the electricity and turned off the lights in their section. The big day arrived, December 11, 1979. The 3 escapees had earlier managed to acquire civilian clothes that guards had left behind. As night fell on the prison, they all changed in their cells. They waited until the time was right, and Jenkins made the first move. Door 1, easy. Door 2 opened with a special broom key, and Jenkins was out on the landing. He walked over to Goldberg's cell, and without saying anything, he looked through the hole and gave him a salute. Jenkins opened the cells of Mumbaris and Lee, and all 3 walked toward the closet as the warden's nightly dose of classical music hit the airwaves. On the way, Mumbaris went to flip the switch box and turn off the lights. Before he left, he messed with the components, making sure that it wouldn't be an easy fix. Goldberg screamed from his cell, desperately trying to get the warden's attention. With the men now cramped inside the tiny closet, the warden heard Goldberg over the music. The hidden men heard those familiar smacks on the concrete as the warden marched toward them, his keys jangling, his heavy body moving slowly up the stairs. They could hear him messing with the flip switch box, and then the lights came back on. "What happened to the lights?" shouted Goldberg. The warden stopped at his cell and explained, and to Goldberg's surprise, the warden asked him something about rugby. The 3 men went through doors 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 with ease, and then they came to door 10. None of the keys worked, not even the wire-based one. The regular-looking door was a lot trickier than it had seemed. In his mind, he could already see it. Government officials on television assuring South Africans that they had thwarted a daring escape attempt by the country's most dangerous political prisoners. The warden was just moments away from his office as Jenkins used every ounce of his skill to manipulate the lock. It was useless. He couldn't do it. He turned to the others, their faces a picture of frazzled nerves. They were beaten. They stood there silent as they heard the warden's office door open and close. Even if they gave up now, they would somehow have to sneak past his office without being seen or heard. The fact was that was never going to happen. Lee and Mumbaris suggested using the chisel and just hacking the lock. But Jenkins wasn't keen on that idea. The plan had always been to escape without leaving a trace. This was the only way that would give them enough time to flee before anyone raised the alarm. If they cut the lock, it wouldn't just draw attention, it would be a death sentence. The sound alone could alert the warden, and even if they made it past the door, they would never clear the prison grounds before a tower guard took aim. Lee and Mumbaris refused to go back to their cells. They were so close. Jenkins didn't have a choice. He handed the task to Mumbaris, who began hacking away at the wood around the lock, just yards from the warden's office. But the warden never appeared. Maybe he was hard of hearing. Maybe luck was finally on their side. Mumbaris removed the last piece of wood, and it happened. The door opened and the warm wind hit the men's faces. Beyond them was the world, their freedom. As they walked into the street, they saw a guard sitting in his car. Fear gripped them. What choice did the men have but to carry on walking? They walked right past the guards, who only saw 3 men in civilian clothes. The men walked and they walked as the sun rose in the distance. They kept going, the edges of their lips curling, smiles eclipsing their faces, joy filling their hearts as they made it to the getaway car. With the help of ANC activists and politicians, the men were smuggled out of South Africa into Mozambique, through Angola, Zambia, and Tanzania, finally to the safe haven of London in the UK, where South African anti-apartheid activists were treated like VIPs. The men had embarrassed the system. It was a great success, but not for Goldberg, who wasn't released until 1985 after serving 22 years. Apartheid ended in the early 90s, and the freed Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa with the ANC in 1994. As for Jenkins, he traveled the world and occasionally gave presentations on lockpicking. As a surgeon of locks, he will forever be known as one of the best there ever was. If you had to escape a SUPERMAX prison, how would you do it? Drop your wildest escape plan in the comments below. Now you need to watch what happens in the first 24 hours in prison. Or have a look at this.